Hello everyone, thanks for tuning in again. My name is Ron Squire and this is On Meaning. So the last time I had posted something or we made a little video was about the Stoics and what I find helpful in their philosophy. But this time I'd like to return to my favorite philosopher, Viktor Frankl. He's the one that inspired me to name the channel On Meaning. Today, what I would like to discuss is identity. We live in an identity-obsessed culture. And it's interesting to me because when I see that obsession over our identity, I immediately think of what Viktor Frankl talked about in one of his books. And we're going to be referring a lot to him today. There's a lot of books here, and none of them are Man's Search for Meaning, by the way. That's what he's most famous for. But these are 4 books that I've read of his that I find extremely helpful, especially in exploring what an identity is, how to develop it, and let's get into it. So when we talk about an identity-obsessed culture, Frankl, I believe, would see that as a sign of an existential vacuum. When we live in a time of despair, meaninglessness, boredom, or apathy, he would say that we are now living in an existential vacuum. And he explores the idea of the existential vacuum in his book, The Unconscious God. So this is from 1975, and I believe that the things written about in this book are just as relevant, if not more, today than they were back then. He believes that an existential vacuum comes from, 1, a loss of tradition and values. Number 2, reductionism. What he means by reductionism is this idea that man has been reduced to nothing but drives and instincts, mechanisms, pulleys, biology, that's all we are. So first thing that he believes an existential vacuum comes from is the loss of tradition and values. Second is the reductionism. And third is an obsession of the self. How obsessed are we? I mean, arguably, I'm kind of obsessed of myself right now that I'm making this video, but I'm really trying to point anyone out there listening towards some answers, because there's a lot of questions about what is the self? What does that mean? And so I'd like to explore some more of that. So what he talks about in a lot of these different books as well is this idea of self-actualization. And that's a very common term in psychology. You may have heard that yourself before sometimes. Going back to the obsession of the self. So how relevant and how prevalent do we see this idea of the obsession with the self? And it's no coincidence that the more obsessed with the self we become, the more miserable we are. Frankl has a genius analogy in one of his books. This is another one of his books, Psychotherapy and Existentialism. It's from 1967. In it, he talks about how he was at a lecture in Melbourne in Australia. He says, I was lecturing at Melbourne University some years ago. I was given as a souvenir an Australian boomerang. While contemplating this unusual gift, it occurred to me that in a sense it was a symbol of human existence. Generally, one assumes that a boomerang returns to the hunter, but actually, I had been told in Australia, a boomerang only comes back to the hunter when it has missed its target, the prey. Well, man also only returns to himself, to being concerned with his self after he has missed his mission, has failed to find a meaning in his life. How amazing is that? When you are trying to live life and somehow you keep returning to yourself, that means that you've missed the target. You've missed a meaning and the potential to fulfill that meaning that is out there for you. What Frankl is getting at with the boomerang analogy is that there is a way to actualize the self, to understand the self, a way to understand one's identity, but it is through the letting go of the self. It is through the looking outward that you can see that you can come to know who you really are. So let's define self-actualization. In this same book, Psychotherapy and Existentialism, Frankl defines self-actualization. He says that self-actualization refers to the fulfillment of the available possibilities or potentialities within the subject. One might well call it potentialism. Here, the life task of the individual is conceived of as the actualizing of potentialities which will fulfill his personality to the greatest possible degree. So if you want to fulfill your personality to the greatest possible degree, that is going to be found in the actualizing of certain potentialities. However, he goes on to really identify what kind of potentialities. Therefore, the degree of self-actualization depends on the number of potentialities realized. But what would be the result if a man should merely actualize the potentials within himself? An answer comes to mind in the case of Socrates. He confessed the potentiality within him to become a criminal, and therefore, if he had succeeded in fully developing his own potentialities, the great defender of law and justice would have been a common lawbreaker. There are potentialities for us to fulfill, but they cannot solely be potentialities within ourselves. There's potentiality out there. And so a way to look at self-actualization, I'm starting to lay the foundation here, and that's what Frankl's doing. To gain a sense of identity is to actualize potential. But the potential to be actualized cannot be within oneself. It cannot be a closed system. He goes on to say this: man's primary concern does not lie in the actualization of his self, but in the realization of values and in the fulfillment of meaning, potentialities, which are to be found in the world rather than within himself or within his own psyche as a closed system. So we have to look outward. We cannot solely rely on coming to a sense of who we are by looking within the self. If you want to actualize that potential, to reach self-actualization, to have an idea of who you are in your personality, you have to look outward. Now, that pursuit, Frankl would argue, is extremely meaningful. But when that pursuit is blocked or halted, or we ourselves are not pursuing that, we overcompensate, or rather we compensate by pursuing pleasure and power. One of the great things that Frankl said is that when man has no sense of meaning, he distracts himself with pleasure. And I can't emphasize that enough, that those who are in here, that I see in my clinical practice, who are struggling with who they are, their identity, they are pursuing, once you really strip down what they're doing in their life and really flesh it out, they're pursuing pleasure. And if they are struggling with who they are, and they are demanding that someone identify them as something that seems to break from reality, that is a pursuit of power. Because how powerful is it for us to have control over what someone calls us and what they tell us and how they address us? See, these are pursuits of power and pleasure when we have failed in pursuing what is meaningful. That's how, in our deep psyches, that's how we compensate for that. To further emphasize this point, I'll turn to another book that Frankl wrote, The Doctor and the Soul. He wrote this in 1946. And when it comes to thinking about life and the role and the place that we have in it, who are we in this existential vacuum that we're in, it's really easy to start to question, what can I expect from life? But one of the things he talks about in The Doctor and the Soul, and I won't necessarily read it, but one of the things he talks about in The Doctor and the Soul is we have to flip that question. Instead of asking, what can I expect from life? We should be asking, what does life expect from me? What is this moment expecting of me? That immediately turns your view outward and starts to lay out some ideas of potentialities that can be fulfilled. And remember, it's in the fulfilling of those potentialities that you start to self-actualize. And when you self-actualize, you have a gaining of identity of who you are. So instead of asking, what can I expect from life, as Frankl says, ask, what is life expecting of me? We're going to be flipping back and forth a little bit here. So now let's go back to the unconscious God. So once again, the unconscious God, written in 1975. This is actually Viktor Frankl's PhD dissertation for his doctorate in philosophy. He speaks of identity in this book. And it's very simple. But what he talks about in here is that identity is responsibility. So let that sink in for a second. Identity is responsibility. And what he means is it's the responsibility that we take on ourselves to fulfill the meaning in our life. Every moment, every day, life is giving us opportunities. It's giving us those questions. It's saying, hey, here's something that is potential for you to fulfill yourself, to fulfill others. By looking at what potential is here, by trying to fulfill that, that is the responsibility that if we take on, we gain a sense of our identity. So let's go back to The Doctor and the Soul. Frankl is an admirer of many philosophers. He really admires Nietzsche. He talks about Jung, and Sartre is Jean-Paul Sartre, but he also talks about Goethe. Goethe is a German playwright and author, thinker, and in The Doctrine of the Soul, he quotes Goethe, and this has to do with understanding who we are, how we come to know ourselves, how we come to gain a sense of identity. So what Frankl quotes Goethe as saying, he says, "How can we learn to know ourselves? Never by reflection, but by action. Try to do your duty, and you will soon find out what you are. But what is your duty? The demands of each day." What I believe is being inferred there is that it's not, if you want to find out who you are, do your duty. It doesn't say follow your heart. It doesn't say pursue pleasure or power. It means do your duty, which implies a sense of responsibility. The more we fulfill our responsibilities, like as Frankl says in The Unconscious God, identity is responsibility. If you want to find out who you are, that is where your identity will be found, is in the actualizing and the pursuing of the fulfillment of responsibilities we have in our life and the demands of each day. So if we are to pursue what is meaningful, a good question to ask is, well, how do I know if what I'm pursuing is meaningful? Or is this just the pursuit of power or pleasure? And that's a really great question. Frankl says it very clearly in one of his other books, The Unheard Cry for Meaning. This also came out, I believe, in the late 70s. And in it, he makes a really clear distinction. He says, an answer to the question of whether individual goals are mere means or meanings, right? So it's very simply put, but he says, in everyday life, we are fully aware of this difference. So you have to take a step back. You have to have some introspection and ask yourself, is what I'm pursuing truly meaningful? Or is what I'm pursuing a means to fill in the blank, feel power, to feel pleasure, to escape some kind of pain? And when we pursue what is truly meaningful, it becomes in and of itself a noble pursuit. It's not a means to an end. It is the end, to pursue what is meaningful. That's what he talks about in The Unheard Cry for Meaning. Great book. Another incredible point that Frankl makes in The Unheard Cry for Meaning. It's another amazing analogy. So we already talked about the boomerang analogy, how if we throw a boomerang out there and it keeps coming back to us, that means we failed. If we continue to come back to ourselves and being distraught with ourselves and who am I, that means we failed, we've missed something. Frankl also comes up with another great analogy of the human eye. This is what he says. Like the healthy eye which does not see itself, man too functions best when he is overlooking and forgetting himself by giving himself. Forgetting himself makes for sensitivity and giving himself for creativity. So the healthy eye, the healthy human eye, think about it this way. If you are seeing your own eyeball, that means something's wrong. The healthy eye does not see itself. The healthy human being does not see itself. It looks outward. It looks for potentialities to fulfill. There's potential out there for all of us to fulfill. And when we look outward and we strive to fulfill that potential, once again, not in a closed system, but outward, that leads to a healthier version of ourselves. We gain a better sense of who we are. So we've explored a little bit about finding one's identity, what self-actualization is. And this is something that I think a lot of people can relate to. We all want to have a better understanding of who we are, why we are. These are questions that people have been wrestling with for ages. And I personally believe that Frankl does a great job of answering some of those questions, where to look. And it's not inside of ourselves. Our identity is not to be found within ourselves, but it is to be found in the context of responsibility. Remember, identity equals responsibility. Our identity is not to be found within ourselves, but in the fulfilling of our responsibilities, in the responsibilities that we have to each other, to the world around us. That is where we will find ourselves. I believe that the more and more we continue to look inward, the more and more we work under the illusion or the delusion that we can identify as whatever we want, that it is completely up to us. That is a further continuation of an obsession with the self, which will continually keep us in a state of that existential vacuum, despair, boredom, apathy. So to sum everything up, one's identity is not to be found within the self. The identity is to be found within the fulfillment of responsibility, within the fulfillment of meaning. Your identity is to be found in the fulfillment of principles, not in pronouns. Your identity is to be found by, or rather developed, by forgetting yourself, by looking outward and seeing what life is asking of you. Remember, you are not to be asking what you can expect from life, but rather what is life expecting of you. If you look outward and you forget yourself, you just may find yourself.